20 years ago, a reality TV series about a struggling promotion aired on Spike TV that, for better or worse, would go on to change the landscape of sports and pop culture. This is a retrospective of that series, its key players, and its lasting legacy. This is TUFtwenty.
TUFtwenty is brought to you by The Contrarians, a movie podcast where we are right and you're wrong. Be sure to subscribe to The Contrarians on your favorite podcatcher for access to this entire series, as well as Julio and Alex's most recent film follies. Our main website, wearethecontrarians.com, houses all of our past episodes as well.
You can find The Contrarians across social media under the handle @ContrarianPrime.
It's not just us, though. As for this 14-part journey of nostalgia and shame, we've got a championship corner.
I'm Joe Holbert, and for years I've discussed fake fighting on the internet. Now, however, I'm trying my hand at the real thing. Usually, you can find me at the Late Night Grim, but for this particular adventure, I'll be sitting under the Team Couture learning tree, providing insight to my fellow men of honor.
It's niche micro-celebrity Steve. You may know me from Twitter, the Songs with Friends podcast, or various scuffles in the world of professional wrestling. By the end of this journey, you are no doubt going to feel this, because this is the ultimate.
Now that the cage door is locked, let's get down to business.
Time to talk asparagus.
But Julio, already I knew he would sniff it out and immediately go, well, hold on, something's missing here. And that's something being Josh Koscheck, the one and only, the public enemy number one of the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. Following The Ultimate Fighter, Josh Koscheck remained in the UFC and really worked his way up while almost reinventing himself skill-wise. By the time he became like a real challenger, Joe, he basically just became another version of Chuck Liddell, where he used his wrestling in reverse and would just knock dudes out cold.
Yep, big time knockout artist, and had that kind of looping right hand, right, to the Chuck comparison. And you know, it wasn't like a clear ascent, right? He had some setbacks. You had the Paulo Thiago fight, which I saw, Alex, you recently put on my timeline, which is a memorable knockout which shocked people at the time. But yeah, he had a really good run of form, and it was 3 wins in full Koscheck fashion. He scored a 3-fight win streak to win his title fight, and 2 of those wins featured moments of infamy in terms of his sort of gamesmanship and questionable tactics and sportsmanship, because of course, Josh Koscheck.
So on the way up, I just do want to mention, because they did rematch in 2007. He fought Diego Sanchez on a pay-per-view, Julio, and it's one of the funnier fights you'll ever see, just because Koscheck refuses to engage with him because he knows Diego wants to counter him. So Koscheck just basically sits on the outside and jabs him the whole night and ends up winning a decision, and he is booed out of the building for it. And this is really where it becomes like Koscheck, and he starts like embracing being the bad guy. He literally would do the Pro Wrestling 101 where he would take shots at like local sports teams for the cities they were in and shit. So yeah, it's not like he goes undefeated for 10 years, but amasses a pretty good record. And then, yeah, the run that builds him towards his title shot, he knocks out Frank Trigg at UFC 103, which I was at, man, there's never been a bigger heel versus heel match than that one right there. But yeah, one of the things Koscheck became infamous for, Julio, was faking fouls. Like in his next fight with Anthony Johnson, he would basically fake being poked in the eyes, and you know, he would allege that something happened to him that upon further inspection did not happen. More famously in the Paul Daly fight, which you know how the infamy of the ending there, the lore behind Daly throwing that cheap shot completely overshadows the fact that in that fight, Koscheck's on all fours and Daly throws a knee that misses him by approximately 7 feet, but Koscheck sells it like he got shot in the face and goes down. And it's so good because the referee, after like 30 seconds of Koscheck on the ground selling it, walks over to him and goes, I just saw the replay on the big screen. It missed you completely. Get up. And Koscheck's just on the ground like, oh, my face. And, you know, really milks it. And the crowd's just like, you know, wanting his head at this point. And this built to his big title fight against George St. Pierre, which was in Montreal, George St. Pierre's hometown. A monster build. Joe, the big thing was just like the immense shit talk that people thought was rolling off of George St. Pierre's back. But when he showed up to that fight, Julio, George St. Pierre seems to be a mild-mannered guy, but Joe can confirm he showed up with the intention of hurting Josh Koscheck.
Yes, and we should note, full circle, Josh they were coaches on the Ultimate Fighter for that deal, right? To set the fight up. So
you're right.
Yes,
Yeah,
now,
good call.
Yeah.
Now you got me. All right.
let me tell you, love him or hate him, most lean to the latter. He was a hoot on the Ultimate Fighter as a coach. There was chaos every turn with him, insulting people personally, trying to start fights.
Hey,
I mean,
on behalf of male nurses, fuck you, Josh Koscheck.
there you go. I was going to say.
That's one of the big points of the whole season, Julio's on GSP's team. He has this guy who's like a male nurse, and like Koscheck obsesses over that. He's like,
I remember
oh,
you
here
brought
comes
it
the
up
male
before.
nurse.
Yeah.
He can't wrap his head around it. Like, just can't.
The dude like is talking shit to Koscheck at one point, and Koscheck just goes, dude, you are literally a male nurse. That's the only point that he has. So this all leads into this fight, easily the biggest fight of Josh Koscheck's career. And GSP was a box office phenomenon, but Koscheck certainly did his part to make this feel like a big deal. But GSP battered Josh Koscheck for 5 rounds, broke his orbital bone.
Ooh.
It was so bad that Koscheck couldn't leave Canada, or he couldn't fly for like 2 weeks because they thought his head would explode because there was like so much pressure inside of it. So, you know, a rough night at the office for Josh Koscheck. He would come back with a pair of wins, and then go on, you know, his unfortunate downturn, losing several fights in the UFC in a row. I mentioned throughout the series, though, Julio, that him and Dana White did not get on. He had many public disputes with the UFC, wanted out of his contract several times, so much so that he rushed the last fight in his contract. He fought 3 weeks after his previous fight just so he could get out of his deal, like just so he could hit the number of fights that he had to have. Joe, being, you know, the aficionados that we are, I knew I could rely on you to kind of explain what happens from here. But Josh Koscheck, not a good relationship with the UFC, and he wanted out.
He did indeed. And he saw one last kind of route of attack in terms of a payday, right, outside of the UFC. As the aforementioned Paul Daly returns to our story here after the sucker punch from UFC, what was it, 113, right, 113?
Mm-hmm.
And so Koscheck headed to Bellator, which was the new kind of secondary, wasn't a new promotion, but it was the new runner-up in MMA. And it was a distant runner-up, but it was the runner-up. And Koscheck kind of seeked that out as a chance to one last big fight, and he would rematch Paul Daly in London, was the idea at least. I had tickets for this fight. It was going to take place in London, England. It was a big event, even though Koscheck had lost, 4 in a row, whatever it had been, 5 in a row. Unfortunately, that fight never took place. He pulled out with an injury, and instead, his career would end on a very, very kind of forgettable note, in which his eventual Bellator debut took place against Mauricio Alonso, who ended with an 11-7 record. Very unheralded fighter, very much intended as a kind of comfortable return to action for Koscheck. But it did not prove to be that way. He was stopped swiftly, and his career ended very kind of flat. I'm not, I don't think Josh Koscheck was a fan favorite or anything, but I think anyone that watched that fight, sympathy may be too strong a word for the general audience, but there was definitely a thing of like, you don't like to see any fighter look that past their best. He's said since then that he barely even felt like present for that fight. I saw an interview with him and John McCarthy, who's a famous referee we saw on the Grin Along. And he literally asked John, like, were you the referee for that fight? And John's like, yep. And he's like, I wasn't even there by that point. I think he hoped the Daly fight would bring some life at him. Unfortunately, the GSP fight and the damage to the eye, it left physical scars, obviously with the injury, but mentally he also was a different fighter, I felt. And even to the point of, Alex mentioned the 2 wins he had, Matt Hughes and Mike Pierce respectively, and old Matt Hughes, we should know, he did not look particularly impressive in those fights. And now you look back on them being his last wins, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, even the Matt Hughes fight, he stops Matt Hughes, but he's getting hit with a jab again, and his eye is starting to wear it in that fight. Mm-hmm. Has some violent losses. Robbie Lawler returns to the UFC by kind of like punching through Josh Koscheck's head at one point. Tyron Woodley switches him out. Like, there's some really violent losses.
Oh, that's a bad one too.
The submission to Ellenberger is probably one of the most gruesome looking submissions that wasn't like a bone breaking, right? With the spit flying and all that stuff. So Josh Koscheck became a really good fighter and a genuine contender, and there's no shame to losing to GSP. However, I do think it did damage to the way people remember him, how kind of dramatically he fell off, because he did fall off considerably.
Yeah, and stepped away from the sport when he signed his deal with Bellator, this is off the top of my head, but I remember there was some sort of deal where it was around the time of the UFC Nike deal, and Josh Koscheck going to Bellator, Dana interpreted that as him trying to steal headlines. Because I don't know if you remember this, Joe, but Koscheck famously posted like his call history on his Instagram page, and it was Dana White had called him like 10 times, just cussing him out. And, Dana White, great guy. But yeah, Julio, I guess the story of Josh Koscheck was he became what, it was thought that he could be with all his raw potential and everything, got to the mountaintop and then lost his shot. And it was never kind of the same from there.
So this, the reunion dinner, the 2018 reunion dinner, when does that happen in this?
That would be a year after Koscheck's last fight. However, Koscheck is like, he's completely disconnected himself from the sport since retiring. Very rarely does interviews unless it's someone that he's familiar with from his past. When he does those interviews, you quickly become aware that he like doesn't watch the fights at all anymore. Way distant. He also is a guy that now believes that like every single thing that you need to power on is tracking you at all times. So, take all of this with it. But he's moved out completely from the sport now. Is my understanding. So I think the idea of a reunion to him was probably like the least appealing thing in the world in 2018, to be honest with you.
Czech Defense is a company that he's a founder and CEO of. I don't know if it's still active, but that's one of the more recent things you can find on there. But like providing military technology assistance and whatnot. So God bless you, Josh Koscheck. We hardly knew ye. Moving on to his foil, Chris Leben, who I wanted to have right before we got into like our finalists here, because Chris Leben definitely has an interesting story and a redemption arc here. After The Ultimate Fighter, went on a 4-fight win streak, and he found his way into a title eliminator fight. Steve, do you by chance remember who debuted to fight Chris Leben to get a shot at the middleweight title?
I do not.
It was a gentleman by the name of Anderson Silva.
Oh, okay then.
So Anderson Silva, for those who knew Anderson Silva coming in, I think it would safe to say they knew he could be a contender in the UFC. But I don't think it's unrealistic to say that no one could have foreseen his reign of dominance that would be to come.
Yeah, no way. And in addition, I think that era, because you're coming off the heels of like, you're not off the heels of, but you're in the midst of guys coming over with big reputations to the UFC, right? And that's when there was that really big trend of Mike Goldberg saying the phrase "octagon jitters," So in hindsight, it is preposterous that Chris Leben would have to fight Anderson Silva at any time in their lives, really. At the time, I think people in the know realized how much of a terrible matchup that was for Leben. This really slick, speedy striker with accuracy against a guy who's like a zombie. But I'm sure there were people in the UFC at the time that were, well, the octagon jitters, Leben's tough and so on and so forth. But Leben will be the first of many victims in the octagon as Anderson will become obviously one of the most iconic UFC champions ever.
Yeah, so he fights this guy, Anderson Silva, Julio, who following his victory over Chris Leben, Anderson Silva would go on to win almost 20 consecutive fights until he lost in 2013 is when he lost to Chris Weidman. Yeah. So this would have been almost a decade of dominance. So it does not go well for Chris Leben. He gets the absolute shit beat out of him, knocked out within a minute in this fight. The reason I'm fixating on this so much is because after he gets knocked out, they cut to Josh Koscheck in the crowd going, woo, like celebrating. After that, he would rebound with a knockout of George Santiago. That Joe, going over the list, like he knocked out Jorge Rivera, Santiago. Like he knocked out a lot of tough guys, man.
Yes.
Alessio Sakara. Yeah.
And that actually, the fact that Leben sustained beyond the Anderson defeat was one of many examples where Anderson's kind of legacy and aura grew based on what other guys did beyond Anderson, right? Like, yeah. Leben was, if you stood with Leben, you were in real danger against almost anyone else. But Anderson Silva looked like he was in there fighting me. Like it's, he was a great example of the action fighter, right? The fans loved him because he brought action, and he was up and down. But he did have some good wins, certainly.
Yeah, in his career, Julio, it's not like Koscheck. Leben was pretty, batting 500. He would win really impressively. He would also lose very impressively sometimes. We watched what undoubtedly to me is the biggest win he had on that grin-along where he choked out Akiyama. He won one more fight after that when he knocked out Vanderlei Silva, who that fight, both those guys, it was basically just whoever landed first, and Leben landed first in that one. In between those two fights, though, I think was really the end of Chris Leben. He was knocked out by a guy named Brian Stan, and Leben was never the same after that in terms of Leben was never Bruce Lee quick by any means, but his reflexes were completely shot. He went on a 4-fight losing streak to end his career, and that last one against Uriah Hall, he actually quit in between rounds because it was just like, I can't do it. It's which of course is an unfortunate way to end your career, but he was honest with himself during that time and a little bit after he retired, ran into some legal troubles, but after such really started turning his life around because he did really damage his heart with all the drugs and drinking that he had done. And he's since been sober since 2015. I remember during COVID, he was one of those guys that got it really bad and hospitalized, I think due to his previous health issues, but he's been doing really well. And, Joe and I have kind of talked up his redemption arc here, but he runs a gym now and he is actually taken up judging. So he's one of the guys that'll be cage side, judging fights now and whatnot.
Okay,
I think he
for
might
a
even
second, I thought you meant law, he's a judge, like a county or JP. Okay.
Leben's court.
Yeah. Alternate universe.
So,
God, that's like he went to school. He just shot through the
got his
ranks.
degree.
Leben's court specializes in family law.
They couldn't get a mortarboard big enough to fit that dude's fucking head, man. Imagine that. A hell of a fighter, a really entertaining fighter, I should say. And, we definitely had our qualms with him in this show, but a legitimate redemption arc that he had. And, you can even see that kind of shine through in that reunion piece they did. So,
and he got he got to kind of close things out on his own terms as a fighter too, right? He had the bare knuckle boxing run where I think he retired on a knockout win, almost certain. So that was cool too, because based on what he went through, him fighting ever again seemed ridiculous and seemed like a mistake. Once he got in there, he actually did fine because, of course, he did. He's a different breed of fighter, I think it's fair to say.
I can see how knowing all this, knowing how his story ends, can help you endure his antics in the show a little more.
Yeah.
Definitely power through, man.
Well, because that eventually he becomes a better person, I guess.
Yeah. It's the inverse of Chris Benoit. You watch his stuff, you're like, God, you were so good. Why'd you have to do it, man? One of my dad's favorite fighters, too. Feel the need to call that out. My dad, he was a big fan of Melvin Gillard and Chris Leben. He loved watching them fight because of what we said. They would either win spectacularly or lose spectacularly. On to our finalists now. Kenny Florian, the one person Julio knew coming into this that we were all like, what the hell are you talking about, man? BattleBots. Kenny Florian had a prosperous UFC career, kind of similar to Josh Koscheck, through moving around weight classes, was able to not only once, twice, but thrice make it up to the summit of a world championship shot. Unfortunately, lost all three of those fights, but there was a run that Kenny Florian went on in the mid to late 2000s. I think he won 6 or 7 fights in a row. That was very impressive. Put away legit people like Joe Lozon, Joe Stevenson, Roger Huerta. He was a legit fighter, and I was there for his final fight. It was at UFC 136 in Houston when he fought Jose Aldo. That was 2011, and I think for him it got to the point where it was just well, I've tried and doesn't look like I'm ever going to be a world champion. So he ended up calling it a day with a 14-6 record, and still does appearances for the UFC to break down fights. And I guess he's most famously known for his time on BattleBots.
He got the broadcaster thing, right? There was a and that
Kenny Florian went on to become a successful broadcaster.
Yeah.
Steve, I'll pose this question as we get ready to move into who defeated Kenny for the first Ultimate Fighter plaque. Kenny Florian, do you think at this point, this is like the Randy and Chuck thing, do you think his legacy is more secure and more almost endearing than Diego Sanchez?
I don't really ever hear people talk about Kid Flo, unless we're talking BattleBots. Something of a legend in two sports, really, when you look at it like that. But yeah, I mean, he's always around. Isn't he a commentator now?
I think he does like the pre and post game shows on ESPN.
Yeah. So, obviously he's impressed enough people, to have a job so long after The Ultimate Fighter. And I think that's most people experiences with him now is as the guy behind the stick.
Yeah.
I don't hear much breakdown ever in talks in terms of his fights or performances in the past. But yeah, overall, I think as a person, he's more revered, but not for the same reasons as Aurélie Couture.
Yeah. It's a shame because he's, of the cast, he has one of the most skilled guys that came from the show.
Yeah.
He was very, very good fighter. So, lighter weights, he just came up against some really, really good champions, man. It's tough.
But look at the fan base now, the kind of people UFC draws now.
Yeah.
Are the same people who are very hyped up about previously addressed white trash icon Kid Rock. It's not the same kind of person who would appreciate the skill set of a Kid Flo.
Yeah, good call.
Good looking, educated kid that wins very tactically is not really in the cards anymore. But yeah, to your point, Joe, if you look over, he has visually, if you look over his fight record, one of the most impressive. Like it's in some cases a who's who, especially towards the tail end of his career. And, really impressive performances too. I remember the back-to-back Clay Guida and Gomi fights. He just put those dudes away. But he was beaten by the bigger man, Diego Sanchez. And I think you will hear more people talk about Diego Sanchez than Kenny Florian, but I'm not sure in a positive light. Diego was the nightmare, went on a huge win streak that included a win over Nick Diaz. He beat Carl Parisian and was going to, potentially fight for a title. That's when he ran into Josh Koscheck that we mentioned. And then he also lost the next fight to John Fitch when he was just overmatched size-wise. But again, ended up going on a bit of a hot streak that included one of the all-time UFC fights in which he beat Clay Guida. And that earned not only the fight of the year, but it earned him a title shot against the then champion BJ Penn. Another fight that I happened to be at, that was in Memphis, Tennessee. Me and my buddies just spur of the moment on Friday. It was like, hey, should we drive to Memphis and scalp tickets to this? That's what we decided to do. BJ Penn, Julio, beat Diego Sanchez like he owed everyone in his ancestry money. He beat the shit out of Diego Sanchez from literally the opening bell. He dropped him with the right hand and just pummeled him incessantly until the end of the fifth round when the fight was called off due to a cut. We're talking about cuts with the Leben incident. It's one of the worst cuts I've ever seen because it was one of those that it started bleeding, but then it was so deep, like it just separated the skin from the skull and you could fucking see into his head. It was gnarly shit.
Diego was cut.
Diego was cut,
Yeah, okay.
Yes. After BJ Penn threw, I believe, the only head kick of his entire career. I remember marking out about that out there. It was like, BJ threw a head kick. What the fuck? This would be the point in time, though, to call out that Diego Sanchez started chanting yes to himself on the way to the octagon, which would be borrowed by famed pro wrestler Bryan Danielson, who, Steve, I believe he's made a decent amount of coin off of saying the word yes.
Yeah, his was the first shirt that started as a bootleg that WWE then co-opted and started making themselves.
Forgot about that. He also, Julio, this was around the time Diego sometimes would carry like a huge cross with him and he would just point it towards the octagon as he was coming out, like saying the power of Christ compels you and stuff like that. Joe,
Tracks.
His quirks, I guess, as they were, I guess they were kind of funny. It always seemed like people were kind of more laughing at him than thinking, oh, he's a character.
Yeah, very much. And I think that's one of those things you reflect on differently perhaps now, right? I think Diego's unraveling, which I'm sure you'll detail here in a moment, is not one that you can point to and kind of go, it's the guys you least expect. I mean, in hindsight, really, he may as well have kind of put a banner over his head. I mean, many warning signs as to the challenges he would have when it was no longer time for him to be an elite pro fighter. And he would sure try to maintain that status, but it would lead him down a pretty unique path, I'll say that. I mean, he's been a pretty brutal story in the last, God, it's been a long time now, certainly.
Were you rooting for him, Alex, when you went to see him in that fight? And you were
No.
just crushed when he got his ass kicked? Or
No, and I'm not even a big BJ Penn fan, and I wasn't then, but like Diego by that point had become like so annoying and so like, again, I have no problem with religion, but everything he said was God gives me the power to do this. God, and it was like, dude, you're a fucking cage fighter. Calm the fuck down. And I also was bummed because his previous fight, I thought Clay Guida had done enough to at least get a draw on that. And so that I held on to that for a little bit. I was resentful. After the loss to BJ in 2009, for the next, over a decade, he would continue to fight, but never string together more than 2 wins in a row. Many losses along the way, some pretty brutal ones. Joe Lozon battered him. Ali Quinta put him out. Matt Brown sent him into another dimension. It's, jumping kind of ahead to now, that Dark Side of the Cage had an episode focused solely on Diego, and it's sad. He sounds worse than Chuck Liddell does present day. Like it's very like labored speech that he has. And more concerningly, Julio, towards the end of his run in the UFC, his last fight in the UFC was 2020. I joked about this previously about how he stopped having like a full training camp and he just had like this shaman in his corner that would just provide positive reinforcement. So that story is a lot more sad than that. It was basically this swindler that took advantage of him and didn't quite leave him destitute, but took a lot of Diego's money and ruined Diego's kind of relationships and reputation. And, Joe, I'm kind of summarizing this with the bullet points, but it was, that guy had really fucked up Diego's life.
Yeah, and it was just a public fiasco. I mentioned earlier there was a infamous occasion in which Mike Swick had him on his podcast and kind of just let him speak for himself and let him kind of reveal how much of a fraud he was, right? And it became like a soap opera surrounding Diego's fights, which was horrible because as much as he was up and down after the BJ fight and he was more of like an action fighter journeyman, gatekeeper even, the sentiment was still pretty positive until it became very clear that he was like an active kind of tragedy waiting to happen. And then it became very, very different. And I mean, again, if we're getting ahead of myself, he would leave the UFC in 2020, which was way overdue, and he would fight beyond that. He's been someone that I've actively avoided seeing fight for years now because I just I want no part of even what could happen. He has no business fighting at this point,
After
let alone without
Matt
a
Brown
trainer.
fight. The Matt Brown fight
exactly.
was like the one I was like, all right, this guy needs to step away.
Yeah.
But yeah, Julio, he's continued fighting on in MMA and also moved on to an attempt at bare knuckle boxing. This was in 2023 when he fought fucking Austin Trout, which that name might mean something to Joe, but outside of that, I don't know. It's
Yeah.
he fought like a championship level boxer in bare knuckle fighting. Like it was ridiculous. So
A guy who had a real fight with Canelo,
Yeah.
it's just absurd.
unfortunate turn of events and downturn for the nightmare Diego Sanchez, who eventually became the dream because he was tired of the negative connotation that the nightmare had. So again, to Joe's point, the warning signs had been there the whole time. I mean, he was doing yoga on TV back in 2005. We should have known this,
So he's still fighting, like this year.
In more ways than one.
Yes. But I mean, 2025, if you wanted to, you could see Diego Sanchez fight.
Oh, well, here you go. Diego Sanchez is scheduled to fight John McDessie in a boxing debut on April 12th of 2025. So in a few weeks here, yes, you can go see Diego Sanchez if you'd like to.
Field trip, boys. Let's go.
That's what Diego's brain needs. Boxing is what he needs,
It's I'm glad we're going to end this on a positive note because, I would hate for the legacy of the first winner of the Ultimate Fighter to be the kind of complicated and upsetting one that Diego Sanchez has. Sorry, Julio, but before we can get to more positivity, we have to take one last stop on, the more dark side of things here, on the more macabre, as we move to our light heavyweight finalist, Stephan Bonner, who, following the Ultimate Fighter, had back and forth, I would say middling success because he fought some real dudes. He beat Keith Jardine. He beat Krzysztof Sosinski. They had a pair of fights that were absolutely fantastic, just bloodbaths back and forth. But, he stumbled along the way. I would say infamously, lost to Mark Coleman in 2009, which would be like losing to Mark Coleman in 2009. I think one of the things Stephan Bonner's career will most be known for was he was John Jones's coming out fight, where John Jones ragdolled Stephan Bonner and just had his way with him for 15 minutes. And John Jones went on to become one of the biggest stars and debatable, but one of the most dominant champions the sport's ever seen. He fought in the UFC up until 2012. His last fight was against the aforementioned Anderson Silva. Joe, something happened to that pay-per-view. Like the main event fell apart maybe a week beforehand, and they had to just throw that fight together at the last second.
They did, and that was the last Anderson Silva win before the Weidman defeat. So it proved to be a piece of history, and it also is the fight where Anderson famously moves himself with his back to the cage and stays there, daring Bonner to try and hit him. Has his back to the fence, and he's like Muhammad Ali reincarnated, and he's turning his head on the strikes, and then he moves away from the fence and goes, actually, I'll go back. In the middle of the fight, he did this.
That's right.
So yeah, I'll always remember that. And Bonner was a very durable guy, and Anderson, like we mentioned with Leben earlier, kind of just ended it when he wanted to. But yeah, and he felt a drug test coming out of that too, right? Which is why it was his last fight in the UFC, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, and he also announced his retirement after that fight, which was not to be, as in 2014, he would come back for his lone Bellator fight. And Steve, I'd ask you to take the wheel here for the closing days in the career of Stephan Bonner and the next ventures that he found himself in.
Yeah, unfortunately, boys, I'm taking the wheel right to the scene of multiple accidents here.
Oh, God.
He announces his retirement, full of steroids, can't beat Anderson Silva. And I saw clips of, they were asking various fighters, what are your thoughts on Stephan popping positive for steroids? They're like, yeah, did you see him? I've never heard him speak so openly about someone's positive failure. But the fight with Forrest from the TUFtwenty finale was the first fight inducted into the Hall of Fame. After Stephan's retirement. He popped into Bellator for one fight where he fought Tito Ortiz and lost. And part of the build for Stephan face-to-face with Tito Ortiz says something to the effect of, I don't know how Jenna dealt with you as long as she did, in reference to Jenna Jameson, his wife.
That's also, they did the pro wrestling angle where Stephan unmasked Justin McCulley to be in his corner.
He did turn to professional wrestling, where all careers go to flourish. Impact Wrestling, where he wrestled such luminaries as Speedball Bailey. No, he wrestled Speedball Bailey on the Indies. He lost to King Mo and Bobby Lashley, teaming with Moose, and then later he wrestled Moose. I don't ever like to talk about Moose.
Steve, did you watch any of his matches, or was he any good?
He wasn't bad. He had a knack for it. He actually, it's not covered on his Wikipedia, but he came to the world famous Jeffersonville Arena during this run to wrestle for Paradigm during the first UWFI rules tournament they did.
God bless.
And yet, seeing Stephan, who is a very large man among modern independent professional wrestlers, was a hoot because he was a head taller than everyone else on the show. It's like the height chart was Stephan, then me, then the wrestlers. But during this time, he also found himself entangled in some legal issues. A very dramatic DUI unfolded in October 2018, where the Highway Patrol received reports that his red Cadillac was swerving throughout the road, making unsafe lane changes. And when they got there, they found Stephan tied up in the vehicle because bystanders took it upon themselves to secure Stephan as he tried to flee the scene.
What?
I
remember I don't remember the day that happened, but I remember it was his mugshot too was really fucking intense, and they made it sound like Grand Theft Auto style shit.
Yeah. Later, he got into an altercation with physicians at the Clark County Hospital, where his story, I saw him do 2 interviews about this. His story was that he had a pro wrestling match. He came off the top with an elbow drop and tweaked his back. But because he was a known user of addictive substances, they ended up, it was the way they framed the question as he said it, was that, so you're here for pain management, which a lot of drug addicts will come to the ER for their fix, so to speak. Him not knowing the terminology answered, well, yes, I want you to manage my pain. and they put him out of the hospital, refused to treat him. Then he refused to leave. Cops get involved. It's a whole thing. In one of these interviews he does, well, on somebody's podcast, he's laying in bed shirtless and just looking gaunt. And the host asked him, "So are you a drug addict?" He said, "Hey, man, fuck you. I ain't no drug addict."
Oh, God.
So they did a follow-up interview where Stephan put a shirt on for this one, but he's still not looking well. He did apologize for his behavior, noted that he'd been dealing with multiple lingering injuries, most notably to his back and his knees, that led to him leaving fighting and originally getting connected with pain pills. Unfortunately, Stephan did pass away on December 22nd of 2022. The original reporting was that it was a heart-related ailment, but it turns out he died of an accidental fentanyl overdose. So, RIP to the big man.
I knew that there was a pretty good chance that Stephan hadn't made it all the way to 2025, because when I was syncing some of the early recordings we did, there was a story. It's something where you mentioned Stephan and you said RIP. And I was like, is he being serious or not? I couldn't tell.
My trademark, yeah.
Yeah. Stephen just saying that somebody's dead, or is that person really dead? That was that. And I don't know if it was that same recording where you said that you actually met him and talked to him.
Yeah. He was selling Ultimate Fighter swag at this wrestling show. You can get an autographed picture of him and Forrest together. Like, obviously it wasn't Forrest autographed, but Stephan, you can get his half of that.
That is fucking wrestling 101 right there. Indie wrestling bullshit, man.
Oh yeah. Mose, formerly of the Sobros, now indie commentator at various shows in front of 40 people. Like, he cleaned up. Like, he got every piece of swag that Stephan had to sell that night. He was so excited.
Well, Stephan, as far as a fighter goes, was always someone you could count on for at least a little bit of action and excitement. So, yeah, an interesting career, and seems like he just kind of strayed off the path there at the end. And, not to cast judgment on an entire industry, but if you're having some problems and, getting on the right path, turning to pro wrestling probably ain't the best idea. That'll just expedite the process.
Well, they asked him in this interview, like, have you turned to UFC for help? And he's like, you think Dana doesn't know I'm fucked up? No, I'm not going to call them asking for a handout. I mean, look at me. They know I'm not okay. Like, they'll reach out if they want to, was his stance. RIP
Stephan. Moving on lastly to the final contestant on the first season of The Ultimate Fighter, Stephan's dancing partner and one of the most historic, if not the most important UFC fights ever, Forrest Griffin, who also we covered a little bit in our Grin Along. We followed his path to the title and watched his championship fight with Quentin Rampage Jackson, where I think we all kind of reached the conclusion there, myself, Steve, and Joe, that was like the keystone of his career. And for that one night, it all came together. He was able to, like, a performance unlike any that he would ever go on to have. He did beat Shogun Hua previously. I told my personal anecdote about that. That's what got him the title shot. That was big fucking deal when that happened too. So Forrest had popularity from the show, but it only grew with these back-to-back wins. He also had a rivalry with Tito Ortiz that saw them fight 3 times, I believe.
Yep.
That honestly was the last thing that really kept Tito relevant, was he had that feud and that, the trilogy fight to fall back on. After defeating Rampage, he was a one-and-done champion. He fought Rashad Evans in the main event of UFC 92, my favorite UFC event of all time. Rashad Evans, Julio, I mentioned him earlier, but he won the second season of The Ultimate Fighter, so the pay-per-view was billed as, tough 1 versus tough 2 winners. Uh-huh. And Forrest looked good in the fight, but Rashad was just too fast for him and pounded him out in a pretty vicious fashion. The Tough Killer shows back up as Anderson Silva fought Forrest Griffin at UFC 101, and we've already talked about how badly he beat up Chris Leben and Stephan Bonner, but this one was more like he made Forrest look like he was fighting in slow motion. It's one of those fights you watch and it's like, what the fuck? Because Forrest didn't land one punch. Anderson had his hands down, moved out of the way of it was like, people say the Matrix, Joe, but that's what this looked like.
It was one-sided enough that people thought it was fixed. Remember, that was a big controversy. I mean, not people with any kind of, awareness of Anderson Silva, but the wider fan that had just bought the pay-per-view, they thought it was a fixed fight. Because, hilariously, the idea was that Forrest was going to be like a sort of humbling experience for Anderson because he was a bigger man. And that was not, I think that just upset Anderson, the idea of that. And he was quite spiteful. Poor Forrest's expense, unfortunately. That is one of the most lopsided fights in the history of the sport.
Wow.
Forrest would fight up until 2012, in which he completed the trilogy with Tito Ortiz. He lost the first fight with Tito by, I believe, split decision. That was like the fight that cemented him as a legitimate contender, not just, a novelty act. And he would go on to defeat Tito in the second and third fight by decision. He was very open at that point in time about, possible deterioration and, the side effects of being a pro fighter and, the knockout losses that he had. So I think for him and for me, for his legacy, he certainly stepped away at a good time. And, Joe called this out already. How many of these guys actually get to step away on a win? It's the way the fighter mind is. It's just, I got one more in me. And especially if you lose, you think you're going to get that back. Chuck was an obvious victim of that. But Forrest stepped away at a good time, and he has since then been with the UFC. Now, he works for their offshoot promotion called Power Slap, which I think is Power Slap is why Trump won twice. Like that's an indication of why our society is the way it is right now. Power Slap is one of the more idiotic things I think I've ever seen. But the point of this story is Forrest helps out with that. He's been employed by the UFC and stayed active. We joked about this. I don't remember if this was in an episode or off air, but after Chuck retired, Dana White gave him a quote unquote desk job. And it was just basically Chuck, when he wanted to, would show up in like board shorts and shit and be like, do I need to do anything? And when they got bought out and they were in cost cutting mode, they cut that right away. But Forrest is active enough at the roles he's been given within the company that he's been employed by them since he retired. I guess that's loyalty, Joe.
I guess, yeah. You should have left the Power Slap part out. You should have just thrown the towel on that one. But yeah, no, I think the perception, the belief is that Forrest is actually good at his job, which I guess is the real reason, right? The rest of it's who cares. He did tell a story recently about a fighter going to the UFC Performance Institute and not recognizing him or not knowing he was a fighter, which is insane to think about, and I think makes all of us feel old. But he's someone I think MMA fans feel very fondly about to this day. And I say that not lightly, because if we're being honest, most of the fighters that we have at different points cherished or revered have kind of damaged that in ways I think Forrest has avoided. And he's also someone I see as like one of the great overachievers, because he was very up and down. He's very inconsistent, but he had a stretch there, a couple of years, where he was a genuine top fighter. And very, very fun character too. Very much so.
So that is our cast. That's where they are now. Quickly, before we move into our closing here, I did mention that after announcing this project, Vice TV got the bright idea to do an episode of their Dark Side of the Cage on the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. Boys, we put them to shame. That episode it's so bad. Like Josh Koscheck's name is not mentioned once in it. And, when you think of the dark side of something, they don't mention Luden Kincaid or Stephan Bonner, like, their untimely passings. They don't mention Swick's illness. If you wanted to, honestly, that Jason Thacker is not involved at all. Not that he's not involved. He's not mentioned at all. If you wanted to, you could almost make like the Ultimate Fighter curse and talk about, the paths a lot of these guys went down. But it really is just fixated on like the comedy of, they were giving us Hot Pockets, not chicken breasts, and they were just trying to get us drunk. And it confirms a lot of what we talked about. Bobby Southworth is one of him and Nate Quarry, I think, are the talking heads they have there. And Bobby confirms when they got there, they had no idea what they were doing. The contracts they signed didn't say anything about fighting. It pivots to talk about like the takeaway from the episode is that Dana White is great. Like that's the big focus. The big focus is like the crescendo of the episode as it builds to the do you want to be a fucking fighter scene. And they have like, people from Spike TV being like, that's a defining moment in television history, reality television history, and like this type of shit. And it's, there's a really interesting story here, and it's not told in that episode at all. That's not to write off the whole series. Their Evan Tanner episode was really good, and the Nick Diaz episode was interesting, but for the amount of time we've spent on this and actual effort we've given it, it's frustrating to see people like, if we had those resources, we could have made something incredible. Not to pat ourselves on the back here, but
would have found Thacker again. Actually,
we would have
get him on video. He would be on that grin along.
Yeah. We would have sent Steve to interview Jason Thacker, being like,
come back with him.
Use my skills as a mental health nurse to bring him back from the depths.
Get a comeback fight out of it. But anyway, the big thing I want to call out to the audience here, the Peanut Gallery, is Randy Couture is on this as well. And he's one of the talking heads. And there's a part in the episode where they talk about how the producers wanted all the fighters to train like as hard as it's portrayed in the show. And Chuck Liddell pipes up. He's like, that's insane. No one trains like that. Like, yeah, but we need this for the show. So they talk about how grueling the workouts were and how, dangerous it was. So they start talking about when Forrest and Stephan were sparring and Stephan gets cut. And then quickly they move to Nate Quarry's injury. And Nate's talking about, we were training in the cage. And then Randy Couture, we cut to Randy Couture's talking head. And Randy Couture, quote, says, I guess one of the guys went to take another guy down and smashed into Nate. Randy not owning up to his mistakes 20 years later.
Okay, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. When was the last time he watched, that episode? And if he has been telling himself that it wasn't his fault all these years, it's possible that at this point he just believes it. That's just.
Thank you, Julio. Thank you. Thank you.
I could see Joe squirming over there, and I was
in big trouble. I was in big trouble.
I like to picture that Nate was right off camera, like off to the side, going, what the fuck?
And to confirm earlier talking points, Randy's looking good. He's got like teeth, porcelain white teeth. His speech pattern's good. And then he cut to Chuck and it's like, well, So I literally gasped when he said that. I was like, Randy, no. The Ultimate Fighter is an institution in the world of MMA now. And the Ultimate Fight, it's fair to say that outside of Diego and Forrest, some of the names they had to go on to win. We mentioned Rashad Evans was a world champion. Michael Bisping was a world champion. Incredibly, Matt Serra was a world champion. Ryan Bader went on to win world titles. Roy Nelson was always right in the hunt. Tony Ferguson was he was like, no pun intended, the boogeyman of the division there for a while. And, in their women's divisions, Juliana Pena, Carla Esparza would go on to win world titles. So there's a rich history of the Ultimate Fighter, but I think it's fair to say, and just for the reasons we've pointed out throughout this entire series, you're not wrong if you say that Diego and Forrest should be regarded as like the most important winners that the show's had. And also because of the things we pointed out, the way the show evolved to where there was never another season like this, where the physical demands were as great. Or Steve, is it fair to say there was nothing ever again as on the line for the promotion and the sport at large as there was on the first season?
Oh no. I mean, there may be some slight exaggeration as to just how important and pivotal the success of the Ultimate Fighter was to UFC as a whole, but not much. It's not like WrestleMania where it's this, we're going to go out of business the next day if this thing shit the bed. But with Tough One, I mean, it gained real momentum. It's not just for UFC, but for Spike. The fact that they had not just the hours of UFC content, but also the hours of Tough content for the next X amount of years, they were able to plug in there and keep their station afloat. Keep in mind, this was the network for men. This thing was going to shoot itself in the foot eventually. So this gave them some room and some capital to work with, for sure.
Joe, looking to where we are now, the next season of The Ultimate Fighter is going to be coached by Daniel Cormier and Chael Sonnen, who are both retired fighters. And I think they're kind of grasping at straws, for the sake of trying to get people to watch the show. And it's just the stakes aren't there anymore. It seems way more of a novelty than something that, could be really interesting or revolutionary.
Yeah. Taking out any attempt to be objective. I think the state of the Ultimate Fighter is a really good reflection of the state of the sport and organization, to be honest. The cage is the same. Guys are still throwing punches and head kicks at each other and trying to submit each other. It certainly don't feel the same. And I think the show still existing is like total content hour brain, just stuff you can sell to TV, to broadcasters. And that very much is in line with what we see most weekends when you tune in to watch the fights nowadays. I mean, the Apex trend in recent years, all of that. And we're all fully aware, like especially with the Contender Series, it isn't now about producing stars or attractions or, God forbid, champions. It's about producing guys that can be on the 8th fight on the undercard at 6 p.m. And that's basically what the sport is now and what the UFC is in particular. So it's pretty much exactly in line with that.
Joe could not have made a better segue. That's unbelievable brain trust we got going on right now. Beautiful segue. The UFC now is exactly what Joe just said. It is a global branded streaming platform that specializes in putting smiles on faces and not paying fighters is basically what it's become. More concerningly, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and this isn't not being dramatic, it's become a right-wing propaganda machine. It peddles the Joe Rogans of the world, and it's always so proud to show when people like Tucker Carlson are in the front row and shit like that. And most hauntingly, upsettingly, and this has no political affiliation. If they were doing this with fucking Biden and Kamala, I'd be like, fuck off. But it's like, when Trump's there, they give him an entrance like he's fucking Goldberg to like walk him out to the cage side to sit down. And it's fucking gross. After that, was that Jones and Stipe, Joe? You and I were texting back and forth about how gross that show seemed because everyone that won was like thanking Trump about how great he is.
Yep.
Yeah. But there's still something that we hold on to. People like myself and Joe, and Steve has gotten sober of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which I applaud him for. But
he's the Chris Leben in this group.
Yes. His heart's in tip-top shape now. This ties into the legacy, and we'll circle back. And there's something that people like myself and Joe hold on to of it's so gross to watch now. There never has a sense of stake any longer. And when we watch now and they tell us this guy is great, I'm always like, is he? I have the Bill Burr approach to it. I'm like, is he good? And back in the day, when it was at its peak, like it always felt like we knew who was good, but this guy might be better. And it was, it was like the sense you get of pro wrestling as a kid. The era of the UFC and, the UFC 40, which we covered in our very first episode, months ago. That's kind of the big bang. Like the UFC was kind of around beforehand, but then it was like, boom, it's here. And that period up until I would say like UFC 100 or somewhere around that, that is such a sustained run of like greatness and nostalgia that you still search for. And now, circling back to nostalgia and shame is when the shame comes into it. But we had that run. And the reason we had that run was because of the Ultimate Fighter and the way the UFC adapted from that and took a new approach to how they're going to present their fighters and their personalities. And man, there was a period of time when like intense MMA fandom, I'm thinking back to like the Sherdog Forum days, Cage Potato, things like that. That was like a more nerdy medium than if I would like get on the internet and just talk about comic books all day, or Legos or some shit. Like those websites, like the niche jokes people would have about MMA and stuff. It was such like a really niche of a niche community, but it felt so fun. And now the standard MMA community is throwing beer bottles at the TV and, probably using some problematic language while doing so. But I go back to that in between. There was that period of just sensation that myself, Joe, Steve, anyone who watched during that time can relate to. And we have the first season of The Ultimate Fighter to thank for that. So I guess, Steve, I'll start with you. That after saying all that, it certainly complicates what we've been here to talk about. This whole idea of like, well, the UFC wouldn't be, the global sports force that it is without this first season, The Ultimate Fighter. But then we also have to take all the bad that came with the good of that and the state of things that it is now. And like I've joked about, like UFC and Dana White had played no small part in swaying the young vote in this last election cycle. And, for the better or worse, depending on your point of view. But it certainly complicates what we've been here to discuss. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, absolutely. It's a big reason why I haven't got back into UFC. I mean, I originally fell off was a combination of John Jones being my favorite fighter and him just proving himself to be a complete shithead, who was also just beyond reproach. Dana's like, it's just a little cocaine. It's fine. Let him keep fighting. I mean, watching that self-destruction, the fights moving to the ESPN app, which early on was just atrocious. As you said, just continuing into the right wing. I've seen clips recently. I thought, man, maybe I should get into it. I will watch a show, the 2-hour pre-show or whatever. And then right before the pay-per-view starts, they will fucking waltz Donald Trump out there with his music like he's coming to defend the WWF title at 86. And I'm like, dude, no, I cannot give this company money. I just cannot do it. Obviously, I think most fighters themselves have never been the brightest guys. I think it's fair to say that you're not going to go into a field where you're going to purposely be concussed unless it's a last-ditch effort.
Yeah. That's what Swick says in that reunion piece. He's like, in our day, if you got into cage fighting, your life went off the path at some point in time.
Yes. And I think that sadly does go to a lot of the fans. I say that as someone who still watches pro wrestling at the age of 43. I know this is a big pot kettle situation. But that attitude, that this culture just breeds negativity. And it's not something I am really interested in being a part of current day. But as you said, the nostalgia, the pain, the shame, it holds on to you, man. I will still watch the old stuff. I still have my Blu-ray of the top 100 of the first UFC 100. So,
Hell yeah. Yep.
And yeah, I will dive into that. But yeah, I can't get on board with what it's become now.
And Joe, moving along to you and, everything Steve said and what we talked about and just thinking about the big acts of the modern UFC being people like fucking Colby Covington and shit like that. And I know you and it used to be better. I, in my heart of hearts, think the era we're discussing, like the fights were better and more entertaining and shit. But just, I guess back to the original point, where we're at today here in 2025, it complicates the legacy of the Ultimate Fighter.
It does a lot. Yeah. I have very fond memories of watching the fights with folks and, like the reactions to big wins and dramatic moments and the excitement of anticipating a fight. Remember that? Like,
oh God, yeah.
3 weeks away from a card, you'd know the exact card, you'd be locked in, feeling strongly about who's going to win and being wrong, being right. That whole experience, that's the thrill. And it left enough of an impression on me that I still tune in, like, again, probably once a month for the pay-per-view shows and almost always leave disappointed. The most positive thing I can say about MMA in 2025 is that it makes me feel slightly better about the culture surrounding pro wrestling. So it has that going for it. I give them 5 years or so because it's the same owners now. So I think, we'll run this back then and I'll probably will have taken that one away. But I love the sport of MMA. And I say that because I think it's important that even though we're talking about the Ultimate Fighter, the sport of MMA used to be an actual thing that you could like beyond just the UFC.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the attempts at competitor brands now, challenger brands now, it is very apparent that we are never going to see one again because they have a complete control of the sport. So if you don't like the way they present the sport, you don't like the way they, promote the sport, you don't like the sport anymore, to be honest with you. And it wasn't that way not that long ago, but it's been that way now for much of the last decade, certainly. And now, I think more than ever, there is no hope for competition, which means there is no hope for a change in the treatment of fighters, which means there is no hope for a change in the way they present and brand the sport as a whole, which means for someone like myself, I'm just holding on. I'm just fumes at this point, keeping me going.
Yeah.
And with each show I watch, I'm less likely to, continue with that. So it's complicated, Alex, it's fair to say.
I want to jump on a quick point that you made about Alex had mentioned earlier this lawsuit and how the judge initially was like, no, I agree with the fighters. We need a settlement, but this isn't enough. The judge is like, this is pretty fucked up. We need to be looking at this more. And the UFC came back with more money. And the fighters themselves were like, well, thank you for looking out for us, but we can't wait another week. Like, I don't have skills to survive now without this money. I appreciate you think we need more, but I need to get what I can get today for my family. And that is just a very sad indictment on the treatment of the fighters.
Yeah. Just wait till they get on Netflix, brother. Everything will be all right then. That's the way it's trending right now, Julio. ESPN and the UFC are not pleased with the way their arrangement's working out. So we'll have Monday Night Raw streaming on Netflix, then followed by Tuesday Night Titans from the UFC on Tuesdays. That's how it's going to go.
Then the Ultimate Fighter on Wednesdays? Is that how it's going to go?
Maybe. Yep. They'll get us on as coaches now after hearing this. Just Joe shows up day one, vintage throwback green Team Couture jersey. All right, boys, get in line. Julio, kind of like some of the other projects we've done, thrown a whole lot of history at you in a short amount of time. And, it's a bit of overload. I think, though, you've kind of can see what we're talking about and how this Dana giveth, Dana take away, because this first season, The Ultimate Fighter, is obviously what led to a huge part of our fandoms, but now it's something that we're kind of like shameful of. What's your main takeaway from this, and just the sense of business practices or what works with the general public? Or I guess, what is your main takeaway from, do we need more reality TV? Is that it?
I don't think anybody would argue that we need more reality TV, but I think watching it divorced from everything else, like just watching the first season as a capsule of like, oh, reality TV back then and what it could do, how it could affect the real world. It's pretty impressive. I mean, I don't know what I was expecting watching it, for the first time. And obviously the fact that it got me to be invested in several of the people in the show, to where we are here, 13, 14 recordings later, and I care about what happened to them, and I am, happy when they turn out to have like a decent life post, their UFC career, and sad when, they haven't, and outraged when, some of the worst things that can happen to some of them. I mean, that kind of stuff, that's just television storytelling working, and so maybe you could say the unsung heroes of The Ultimate Fighter are the people that are not Dana White, that were like behind the camera putting the footage together and, assembling things in a way that would make an audience suddenly give a shit about all the stuff that was happening, beyond the fights. And so I think that's the positive takeaway somewhat, that, if you're going to say something, it's like, yes, there is like the shame. I get the shame mixed with the nostalgia, but I don't think that you can, and maybe it's because I'm not, invested in UFC, in, MMA or whatever, just combat sports in general. So maybe because I'm a little more detached to it, I can just say, well, there's the shame and there's the nostalgia, but also I think that it's not respectable television, but I think it's effective television. And that is a positive at the end, if like you get the talents that put together the first season of The Ultimate Fighter onto another project, you are more than likely going to get something that's just as effective. Now, how that diluted over the years since, I haven't watched any other seasons. It doesn't sound like I should watch any of the recent stuff, but like I said, in a couple of recordings, I am curious to watch, like I would love to watch the Koscheck season. That just sounds like it'd be fun. So in that sense, I mean, I think that the show worked. Like it worked on me. That is a win, I think, for everybody involved. Now, as far as like, has it made me somebody that wants to watch MMA like today? I guess I am lucky that it didn't push the button so hard to where now I have to like decide if I want to watch MMA, like be in the place where you guys are, where I was like, do I want to watch MMA when I know it's like basically it's become a platform for everything I'm disgusted by in this country. And so I'm not at that point because I don't have to, I don't have that connection. It's sad, but I think, Alex, you've also kind of like prepped me along the way, even before we started this, just every time that you've told me stories about just the pro wrestling behind the scenes. So I kind of figured that we were going to end this project with a bittersweet ending at best. So I think that's where we arrived. So I guess where I am is I would be more than happy to watch more like Ultimate Fighter from like the early years. I have no interest in like supporting, directly like the UFC like right now. It's not like this made me a UFC super fan in that sense. But would it
for the best?
But would it do that to other people? Like I think, if you just show the first season of The Ultimate Fighter to somebody that is not an MMA fan, somebody that's just going to, is it like, do you guys consider it's a good introductory piece of like media?
I do, for the business model they had then, where there weren't so many shows. This was a way to get to know some characters. They would have them sprinkled throughout, and then you would get introduced to the other characters in the UFC at large. Now there's so many shows and so many, it's just too much to take in.
Yeah. So there's your answer, Julio.
I mean, no, what I want to see is I'm sure I can find it somewhere. I want to see, because I need to close the loop. So I want to see the third Randy Chuck fight.
Mm.
And then I'm going to
maybe
screenshot it and send it to Joe. Like,
that was spiteful.
Nostalgia. It's nostalgia. And I want to see that Koscheck fight where, his title shot, because you guys have sold it as a big Rocky fight.
Yeah. It's the only time you'll ever see George St. Pierre like get up in a dude's face or in the weigh-in stare down. That's the main thing I remember from it. Maybe one day. Maybe we'll put together another and grin along one of these days. We'll see. Well said, Julio and Steve and Joe. I think we did a good job of encapsulating all our thoughts here. Not to end on like a dour note, we had a lot of fucking fun. There's a lot of intentional and unintentional comedy in this show, and a lot of sticking points that we've had some fun with along the way. So, in closing, number one, thank you, Julio, for allowing us to use our channel for such things. I explained it to him, and he was like, "Okay," and I was like,
"That's not how it went." It was like an okay with an exclamation mark. It's like, okay, I
just put your gloves on. Let's go.
Yeah, I'm glad you actually took something away from this, like the Roxina thing we did. If I had just made you watch all this and you were like, this shit sucks, I would have been like, oh, well, I'm sorry, man. I wasted your time. But, Joe, thank you so much for being part of this, man. You and I collaborate monthly, so we're used to kind of playing off each other, but this was a different venture, and I appreciate you hopping on board for this.
Oh, it was a pleasure. I was really thrilled to be involved. I'm less confident in that, in the sense that this was I got much more of the bitter than the sweet, actually, this conclusion. When we hit record on this, I absolutely did not intend for this to be my tone, but we did have a lot of fun, and it led to, all sorts of different memory lanes, honestly. And it was an absolute pleasure to be involved. It was a great, great time. We've got some, at least, quotes and references out of this that we can drop in the future. And that's the most important thing. That's what we're exactly things we can reference. And if there's someone who can appreciate a good bit, it's who I'm closing with, and that's Steve, not Dr. Death. Steve, you and I have never really done much like this, but again, we're through the wacky world of wrestling. We met in social media, and we communicate, but text back and forth pretty regularly. So you're someone I consider a friend, and I thought could offer a unique perspective, and that certainly came through. So I just want to thank you for hopping on this project with us.
Oh, thank you, man. I was somewhat surprised when I got the text, the activation, if you will, calling me off the bench. But this has been, I've been doing podcasting off and on for 8 years now, and this is one of the more fun projects I've been a part of. So thank you for having me. My pleasure. And to the listening public, we've already gotten some good feedback on this, and we appreciate it greatly. For those of y'all who have stuck with us and listened to 1, 2, or every episode, it's greatly appreciated. Continue to support the Contrarians. Continue to support the Late Night Grin. Continue to follow Steve until you have to just block him because enough is enough. But continue to support us in our future endeavors. Thank you, and good night. Thank you for listening to this episode of TUFtwenty. A reminder to subscribe to the podcast, visit wearethecontrarians.com, and follow the Contrarians across social media at Contrarian Prime. You can also follow Alex individually at Contrarian Alex, and you can check out our other special projects on our Patreon channel at patreon.com/Contrarian Prime. If you want to listen to Alex teach me about The Rock and John Cena, that's where you need to go. You can catch me weekly on the Late Night Grin, live and free on YouTube every Friday night.
In addition, Alex and I collaborate monthly on Grin Grappler, discussing some of pro wrestling's biggest and baddest. If those grins are for you, check out LNG Gold, our YouTube membership plan that includes over 50 hours of exclusive content each month.
You can follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at NotDrDeath. That's NotDrDeath. Or you can block me now and save us both a lot of embarrassment.
Until next time, be sure to make your coaches proud and don't call anyone a fatherless bastard.